this computer? Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to put that down there now, and we are going to switch over to the writers, and hopefully you're going to be able to see this. Please tell me if you can. So I'm going to hit this. All good?
We can't see that. We still see the first presentation.
I was afraid of that. Okay, so that is annoying. Okay, I see what it's doing. So that's exactly the thing we hope to avoid, we cannot. So let me do that. Okay, great. So it's going to ask me to redo the share for each person. So that's fantastic. Let's try this now. So that's just what we're dealing with. And I've got the shared sound on, so that should be good. Try that. Let me try this. Good now?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So should I just go ahead and hit play? Okay, cool.
Well, I just wanted to say something beforehand. Okay, what's mine?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, yes. I just wanted to say that this is Mrs. Christ. She's a Japanese American who was incarcerated in a concentration camp in Utah. And this clip, she describes her realization of her loss of freedom. And we definitely wanted to share this because it just shines light on the world that we wanted to create. Okay, you can press play.
But then one of the things that I remember and left an impression on me was when we were in Tanforan. You know, we had this chain link fence all around the camp. And we lived maybe a quarter of a block away from the fence. And the fence was guarded by soldiers. They walked back and forth with their guns on their shoulders. And I was feeling wistful one day and went up to the fence, and I heard a rustling in the grass. I really was kind of wistful for what was outside the fence and thinking, you know, I used to be able to do that. And what's going on in the world now, you know. Watching the cars go by and people walking by and all. Then there was a snake that was rustling around in the grass. And I saw it, and I put my foot out like this to kind of, or away. Anyway, I moved my foot, and it must have frightened him because it wiggled right underneath the fence. And I thought, oh, that garter snake has a lot more freedom than I have. It can go under the fence and go away, and I can't do that. And I kind of felt awful sorry for myself for a long time after that, realizing that freedom is a very important thing, and that we are not to take it for granted.
The garter snake has a lot more freedom than I have. It can go under the fence and go away, and I can't do that. Next slide.
Sure, so I'll jump in here with this. So I was kind of there at the conception of this project, and with many projects, but specifically with historical projects, when you're coming in, there are particular limitations. There are particular ideas or concepts or themes that you know you want to get across because it's being dictated by the time or by the project that you're going to make. And so it's just kind of talking about what that process looks like. And Dave talked about this in the Zoom yesterday, but this originally started as just a project focused on the Japanese American experience and the rower camp. But as the project evolved, it began to widen the view of the cross-section of who all we were looking at to all of Southeast Arkansas at that time period, and it began to have more than just Japanese American. It had African American, Italian POWs, and Italian immigrants. And when you start writing for something like this, you are more of an investigator than a writer. The first thing that I did was jump into primary sources, secondary sources, and just gathering as much information as you can. And what you do is you begin to see where things line up with predefined themes, historical ideas or concepts, or other aspects that need to be gotten across with the learning goals, or just the interest, the narrative interest. And you begin to see where things line up with each character, which we decided we wanted to have a playable character for each of these cultures, these groups, these experiences that have been identified beforehand. And then it's a matter of lining out a plot, making sure everything makes sense, and you begin to discover new things that fit into slots that begin to expand off those slots. So you're much more of an excavator seeing what fits together than you are someone who's coming in and writing something new. So that's kind of the setup of where we got to. But I'll hand it off to Laura so that the people who did most of the writing and made it in-game can talk about what that experience was like.
Thanks, Greg. Next slide, please, Dave. So for the next little section, we want to introduce you to the characters that arose out of these primary sources. Greg passed the outline of the story and some of the very early drafts of the scenes that became the game slice on to me, and then Brittany came along, and together Brittany and I crafted most of what is seen in the game slice, the playable game slice. And so we have 4 characters that we're following. Margaret Halstead is a woman in, I believe this would put her in her 40s-ish, from New York. She's affluent, she's a lawyer, but she is not necessarily accepted by mainstream culture, and certainly is going to come up against some friction in the South. But it is her mission to uncover these civil rights atrocities that she's been reading about and learning about and assisting with in her legal work. So so we're going to see what happens to Margaret as she enters the South and enters the all of these areas of captivity. I would argue that she is the one that is the most mobile, though all the characters move in some ways, but some of them are able to move in larger geographical areas than others. Next slide, please. Then we have Miho, who has been interned at Rower. She is, I believe this makes her about 16, 17. She's lived up to this point. She's lived a pretty typical American life. She was going to high school and doing all the things that a American teenager would do, and embedded in her Japanese American community in California. But when Executive Order 1066 was rolled out by FDR, she was sent to a holding area at Santa Anita Racetrack. And her story begins as she arrives from Santa Anita on a train to Rower. And so we're going to follow her journey from arrival, empowerment, and until she's finally able to leave the camp at the end of the game. But some of the things that we've learned about was the restrictions on, she would be close to heading into college at this time, and the state of Arkansas decided that internees were not eligible to apply for college in Arkansas, though they were able to in other states. So there was a strange ability to leave in that way. But she's also part of her story becomes a defense of her father. And so we see how Miho is going to become politically active in the game. And what sacrifices will she make? What choices will the player make as they play out Miho's story? Next slide, please.
Alrighty. Our next slide is Leslie. Leslie, he is a 25-year-old African-American man born in Helen, Arkansas in 1917. His father's deceased. His mother and his uncle live in Helena, Arkansas, and he is actually coming to the South to look for work. Something that's really important about him is that he is a recent victim of a peonage case, which is what attracts Margaret to him in the beginning, and you'll see that in the slice as well. When he shows up on the scene, he's looking for work. He wants to earn enough money to send back home to his mother and his uncle. And for his journey, we'll see what it is for African-American men to find work in the South. Next slide. All right, we have Angelo. He's Italian, 23, originally from Italy. And in 1939, he was in the Royal Italian Army. He was eventually caught and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Scotland, where he was abused. In 1943, he was transferred to Monticello. He knows very little English, so that's why he is taking English classes in Monticello in order to work. And one of his objectives is to be able to get contact with his family so he can speak to them. Next slide.
So each of those characters has limitations on their ability to travel and their ability to express things freely. So, and we've discovered that, and again, this was the idea of incorporating folk tales, Japanese, Italian, and African American folk tales into the game was something that sort of, Brittany and I inherited, and unfortunately didn't really get to delve into, because in the slice we decided, for the sake of time and deadlines and etc., that we were gonna just hit some of these key scenes rather than explore any of the folk tales, though we certainly have aspirations to unpack them in different ways that may feel quite different aesthetically from the rest of the game. There's ideas about imagery that might be different, and possibly even the story will play out differently, which is to say they may be more filmic. And the team, the very intelligent team that came before the writers, but they had this idea to use some of the artistic styles of the cultures in the folk tales as they're presented. So we started to tiptoe into it, and certainly the themes of oppression and escape, the power and danger of words, connection to nature, humor, cruelty, and gender, all of those things are there in the slice, but unfortunately we haven't gotten to unpack them into the folktale idea yet. However, some imagery is there. In fact, the Tale of the Brokeback Sparrow, which is a Japanese American folktale about a kind old woman who takes care of a hurt bird and in return receives a magical seed that grows her a magical gourd, which feeds her for life. Meanwhile, her neighbor, who is not so kind, ends up with a gourd that horrible animals come out of the gourd and kill her. So how does that play into the game slice as we see it? We really right now only have the gourd as represented in the gardens at Rower. So, it's a leap right now, but it's there and it wants teasing out still. You can see all the potential and emotional qualities of all these stories and the ways they could influence the player's experience. Next slide, please.
I think that may be it.
Oh, that's it. Okay. No more slides. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how the game how did we get it to this slice form. And again, Brittany and I inherited this great outline that took us through several acts of the game, including the inclusion of where the folk tales might sit. And we as a team, with Dave's guidance and everybody else's input, decided on these scenes based on a couple of different things. And if you, as you play the game, you may or may not be able to feel this, but some of the scenes are meant to feel, the scenes that were chosen were meant to highlight some moments of high conflict, or to highlight some of the mechanics of the game. So the very first scene with Leslie, you know, you get to see like some of the interaction with objects, but really there's nothing that Leslie can do in that scene that doesn't lead to the outcome, which is that he's cornered by these racist Klansmen, as opposed to not racist Klansmen, the Klansmen. And so Brittany, do you want to jump in there? I feel like I'm
talking. Oh no, you're fine. The trap scenes, of course, and the fact that he, you know, in the beginning we find out, we know the health of the characters, he's thirsty, and you look around and you see, oh, it's just a white only water fountain. So just we wanted to make the players feel as if they are the characters and feeling that trap feeling as they were playing the game. And another one we have is exploration. So the Aurora camp is more of an exploration, going in and you'll see, looking at the garden and going to the mess hall, and even going in the mess hall and seeing, oh, what are they cooking, pressing on that, and just exploring the world that they were living in during that time.
And the scene with Angelo is meant to be, I haven't revisited it in the last day, but it's meant to play out more like a film, or more like the player does not have as much choices to experience that game. It just kind of, it unfolds. So the mechanics of that one right now, the mechanics look kind of similar to the other games, to the other scenes. But in a dream world, it would play out more like a film. So highlighting moments of key choice for the characters, emotional depth, and these ways in which the mechanics might work to inform the emotional quality of the player's experience. And then, Brittany, you want to talk a little bit about what we find to be effective in the work that we did and the way it got interpreted into
most definitely. Yeah, we were really excited to play the game. I know I was most definitely. Really loved the showcase of the characters and the mechanics, and loved just how everything just played out, and also the choices that we added, Laura and I added towards the end, of the choices people could choose and how their choices will determine the action of the ending of the scene. I love that as well. And things that we wanted to revisit is, of course, Laura talked about was the folk tales and enhancing that. And I really would love to revisit the character thoughts and actions in contrast with the dialogue, and how we can drive that experience as well.
Yeah, one of the first rules of writing that I learned when I first became a writer is show, don't tell. And I sure could feel it playing the slice, the places where I as a writer had explained way too much. And if I were a player, would want to enjoy the feeling of not totally knowing what's going on and what I need. I think second pass at this, I would want to pull away some of the explanation and let it be either discovered through play or through artifacts. This was a thought I had just now, which is how meaningful it is to find and read a newspaper article or a pamphlet or a photograph, or those were very effective for me in the moments that we see them in the game. But you should know that Brittany and Greg and I really I mean, Greg stepped away a long time ago, but Brittany and I stepped away in the fall, I think, Brittany?
Yeah.
So,
August, September. Mm-hmm.
yeah, so we haven't seen, you know, I hadn't seen any of this. I screamed when I got the link. I mean, I was going,
Yeah.
because it's wild. It's wild to it's just black and white letters on a page, and then these magicians turned it into this experience. So though I, you know, I'm always wanting to you know, improve things, I think that it's off to a wonderful start, and it'll be interesting to see how people experience this. Dave, I think that's it for us. If you have anything else you want to add, or you want us to talk about, we'd love to say.
Well, first, again, a huge debt of gratitude for the work that you both put in, and Greg too, obviously at the front end. And I will always remember our initial design discussions and beginning to think through how we were going to develop this from this kind of big script that we've got to paring it down and thinking through what we're actually going to write and do. Those conversations were really magical and remain so in my mind. And I agree with you. It's really something magical when you start playing it. But you also realize, oh, you could cut this. You could show this way. You could do this. And you can't really get to those recognitions, discoveries until you have a chance to play it through and play it through more. And so this will continue to evolve. It's definitely ongoing. And so we're very happy with where this has landed. But you can see the future out there for this game. And I think it's a very strong prototype, and fingers crossed we can get funding to push it to the fuller game. So I'm going to go, because this is apparently what we got to do. So I'm going to, can I just escape this? Yeah, I can. And I'm going to, hey, maybe we can fool it this way. I'm going to go straight over to, don't be like that. I don't need you to be like that right now. You're just going to do that, aren't you? So annoying. I'll pull you there. Let's go here and see if it is still fooled. Can you see that?
Yep.
Let's hit present, and right?
Yeah.
Right on. Okay, great.
Yeah. So I'm Brianna Jenkins. I'm the art director at Tesseract, and we're going to talk, myself and Micah there. Thea was going to join us, but they had to leave a little bit early. We're going to talk about the development of the art direction for Ivy on the Wire, and then how it naturally changed in the actual development process. Next slide. Next slide.
Cool.
Yeah, so the initial art direction, so when we first had the concept of this game, I was looking at quite a few things and narrowed it down to some recognizable kind of 30s and 40s American art. I was looking at Edward Hopper because I was really interested in his very kind of cinematic scenes. I thought that would work well for our game. Also looking at Georgia O'Keeffe and the way that she just beautifully portrays the landscape, which is an extremely important element to the game. You know, the location in which it's set and how the people relate to the landscape around them. Our overall goals were to express culture and nationality and these cross sections in an accurate way, portray the people, places, and events authentically. Though of course we are fictionalizing some things, we're working off of real evidence, so we want to portray that as authentically as possible. Also engage players emotionally with a limited number of scenes, so try to pack as much as we can into what we have. The folktale section specifically, though we weren't able to add this to the vertical slice, we were drawing on cultural art, preferably during times of the trauma that we're talking about or as a response to this trauma. So thinking specifically about the art produced in the rower camp, that was a big inspiration for what we wanted to do with the Japanese folktales. And also we chose 2D as our method of construction, I think mostly because it was more technically achievable and flexible for us, specifically thinking about producing this for WebGL. Next slide. Yeah, so after doing that research and compiling some influences, are very talented artists. So this is Theo's work and Stevie's work. We're able to come up with some images that set the whole direction for the project. So if you've played the prototype, it's in black and white now, but originally the idea was full color. And I think what's expressed in these brought through a lot of the kind of tonality, cinematic quality, and a real reverence to the landscape. Also producing really wonderful characters that fit in but also contrast with the environment, so they're just a little bit sharper and it really brings the focus to them. Next slide. Yeah, so now on to the production and what got delivered. So going into production, we took the script from our writers, and then the first step was to try to break each of these down into kind of a set list, I guess, of each asset that we would need for each of these scenes. So you can see kind of how the sausage was made there, I suppose, with this really large Excel tracker marking like what stage we are with each asset, where these assets need to go in the project. You know, is it in a thumbnail? Is it a sketch? Is it a final? And which artists are working on those? Which is definitely like a big organizational step in trying to get a whole team to be able to work together and produce this project in an effective way. Next slide. We also did a lot of research for the art. So myself and Theo took part in the initial research, which was a lot of text reading, you know, a lot of articles, a lot of books. We brought that over and distributed kind of where it would be most effective with the other artists. We also looked at another game that was produced previously called Drama in the Delta. Cast Rising Above, they have an online project. You can see the image up there on the top right. That recreated the rower camp in 3D and also has a wonderful collection of all kinds of images and artifacts from the rower camp. We used that pretty significantly as well. We did a location visit in November 19, so we visited Monticello, McGee, and Rower, and of course lots of Google, you know, finding as many images as we can where we can. Next slide. And then the step after that is taking, okay, we have the script, we have an idea of all the assets that we need. So now we need to do some storyboarding to get an idea of, you know, each slide, each scene that we need to have this gameplay play out. So you can see a few of our storyboards there. Next slide. And then we moved on to some more polished concepts. So these concepts are by Theo Mellon. And they, as you'll kind of see in the polished art, really set what our final art direction ended up being. So for time constraints, and I'll talk about this a little more later, we ended up scaling back to just black and white. And these, I think, ended up being our kind of setting for what we wanted to achieve. Next slide. Yeah, so these are our final characters. The designs are quite similar to what we had previously, but they're in black and white with a few tones of gray. Next slide. And this is part of Theo's development. So they worked on the McGee train station. And a couple of our artists, and Micah will talk about this some more in a minute, actually set up the location, or, you know, kind of the hero piece of the location in 3 dimensions in a modeling program, which helped them achieve more cinematic shots because they were easily able to move around, figure out what shots looked the best, and then work off of that for their final drawings. So it's just a much quicker way of testing out, you know, how this is going to look and then being able to be easily accurate. Next slide. Yeah, so this is what the train station turned out in the final. So you can see how that 3D work influenced this and was really helpful. So this is scenes 5 and 6. Next slide. Yeah, and then I'll hand it over to you, Micah.
Yeah, and this is I was responsible for several backgrounds at Rower, and they were all going to be uh, in similar locations and things. And you can see I started off, my reference board is over here in the upper left. And some of these photos are like from Rower and some are just from other camps because I wanted higher resolutions, being able to see the buildings, different things like that. I did make extensive use of casts rising above, as you can see in the upper right, and in the bottom left. That's actually a screenshot of the Maya modeling program that I used. And I took a screenshot of the map that Cast had, and I laid it down there. And I very simply modeled like the surrounding area so that I could basically get what you see in the bottom right here. So like really lay it out, because there's so many repeated elements in the camp, and the camps are, at least like as a whole, like looking at them from like the outside, they're not like it's full of repeated elements, and it's full of, I don't really know what I'm trying to say exactly right there, but it's like
Very structured.
yeah, it's very structured, and it's not a happy place, you know. And so like using these very simple models that I made, because I whipped up these models very quickly and laying them out, it's sort of like the methodical nature of that sort of like, I feel like it captures the sort of like some undertones of like being like interned in a camp or something. But yeah, you can see I actually, there's a guard there in the bottom right that I placed in there from Theo to like actually set up the scene, that you can kind of see, like not the lime green, but the green under that is one of the cameras that I used. And like you will be able to see on the next slide the exact like view that I did for this one. And you can go ahead and flip over to the next slide. Yeah, and so the top left one is one of my backgrounds, and that's basically exactly what you saw there. And you can see what I was kind of talking about, where it's just like, for as far as the eye can see, it's pretty much just these buildings that these people were living in. And I mean, we have like a tree line back there, but like the terrain here is like very flat, and just a lot of it is like beaten dirt, and just building after building after building, and they're all identical. So well, not all of them are identical, but there's like 2 or 3 different buildings that were just done like over and over again, essentially. It's a very interesting sort of composition to like put together. But yeah, I found laying it out in 3D helped me a lot, since my 2D skills are more on the character side than on the environment side. And yeah, I thought I'm pretty pleased with the results overall. And the one on the right here is I believe our artist Stevie did that one, and the bottom one is Alex.
Yeah, so we had a variety of artists working even in the same scene. Yeah. Do you have any more to add on that, Micah?
I don't think so. I think we're good to go on to the next slide.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is our lumberyard setting, so that's scene 13. Our artist Rachel worked on that. And as Laura was explaining a little more, it is much more of a movie type scene. So it's not completely animated, sort of like a smooth, movie. It is kind of click and you get a new image, click and you get a new image. But I think it's able to have more dynamism than some of our other scenes, because it is made in a movie sort of way, because in the other scenes, we were developing the characters split out from the environment, so we're trying to reuse a lot of them. So the characters are actually able to have a really defined place in the scene and have more interaction with the backgrounds. Next slide. Yeah, so Theo also worked on our UI design. And in the beginning, we were wanting to have, I think, a more robust UI system, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that changed as well. But we still ended in a really good spot. We were able to have a really nice inventory system with these different items that you can look at that are, each individual characters. You can get a little bit more information. It's kind of a really nice world building element to see what they're carrying around and what they think about those items. But you can see a couple of the iterations that we went through here. Also trying to make the conversation pretty dynamic. So it's not completely static, and you have a little bit of animation with the chat bubbles there, and it feels like you're actually responding and being responded to as you have a conversation. Next slide. Yeah, so why the changes? Because it kind of ended up in quite a different spot from where it was, though I think there are some elements that carried over. Mostly there was a reduction in complexity to fit the time frame. So that's mostly what drove our use of black and white and grayscale instead of color. There was definitely a simplification of line work and tones as well to help reduce complexity, and a reduction of small detail in a lot of the scenes. So they became a little less detailed. There was also just some natural drifts while all of the artists aligned their style, and we got a pretty even style across the board. And there was also some changes to align with the design and reduce the cost in other disciplines. I think that's primarily what drove the simplification of some of the UI. Yeah, next slide. So my assessment and what we want to do moving forward, I think overall I really like the style that we landed on. I think it ended up being really effective to tell the story. One big thing is that I'd really like to reintroduce color when we're able to move forward, just because I think black and white makes it feel like it is more in the past than it actually is, because it's really not that long ago that all of this happened. I think we could leverage more 3D modeling to assist artists. So we only had a couple artists use that methodology, but I think it was really helpful. And I also think it could be really helpful to align artists that are working on a single location, like in Rower. I think we could also push making the landscape and the lighting more dynamic. Not that in its changing or moving, just that it is a little more present in the compositions. Because again, I think bringing in the importance of the landscape needs to happen, because it just has so many ties to the story. And also change how we're setting it up in Engine. You might see a little bit more of this later, but moving away from composing everything as UI and setting these pieces up in actual world space. So basically layering images on top of each other in the engine instead of trying to layer them on top of each other in the UI system. So yeah, that's all I have.
No, that was great. And I think maybe people can begin to see the complexity of pulling all this together from writers to artists. And it's definitely another piece of that complexity is the coding. So we're going to switch to that. And I think it's going to be pretty smooth, hopefully. So let me go ahead and present that. And I think, Adam, you are up for that.
Yeah, I just have one slide. Bree, I wanted to ask, when you're talking about moving to composing in scene, are you talking about maybe the conversation system, or?
I'm talking about the environments and the characters.
Oh, okay, so breaking up the environments into individual sprites. Okay, you got me worried there for a little bit.
Yeah, no, not the conversation system.
Okay, so I'm going to give a little brief background as to how it works. I'm not going to go into too much detail, just because it's easy to overanalyze technical stuff, and it's not the most exciting thing in the world. But basically, the whole game is composed of these FSMs, or finite state machines, and what that is effectively is a flowchart. So the game is just representing where you're at on the flowchart at any given time. So like the script is transformed into this form here, that's a screenshot of it that you can see, and then each of those is going to, like, based on the player's input, direct you to the different states, which then will display the relevant dialogue. This is the scene 9 front gate FSM, so this is when you go talk to the guard, and you have already decided the method by which you're going to enter the camp, so you have that switch there. You talk to the guard, and then, you know, he responds to you differently based on how you choose to present yourself. I think the most interesting thing about this code base is that it really is really prototypey. It fundamentally is the same code base that I wrote in December of 2019, I want to say, in the span of maybe 2 weeks. And a lot of it hasn't changed. And that mostly means that, yeah, there are very few concepts that are reified in the code base. There are very few things that the code actually considers existing. For instance, like characters don't exist. There's nothing in the code base that talks about characters. Basically, it's just the dialogue exists. And while that was fine for a prototype, I think in the future I'd actually want to go back and do some significant refactoring and restructuring of that system, because as we approached release, because you don't have these concepts defined anywhere in code, it tends to lead to lots of little finicky bugs, and you have to bring a lot of things in alignment as a human being that really the computer should be doing. So, like, for instance, the character portraits right now are set, I believe, on the dialogue level. Because it's a dialogue first system, characters don't really exist. But like a really obvious refactor, and one that I really wish that I'd done, is actually like create like a cast data structure that holds all of the relevant character portraits, so that when designers are building these FSMs, because these are built by hand, they can just click from a little drop down and say they should be angry for this line or something. So I think it served its purpose for this project, and actually it helped in some ways because it's so flat and so few things are reified. It's very flexible, which is what really helped, especially as over the summer we were discussing various mechanical opportunities that we could do. A lot of those didn't end up happening beyond the design stage, but that's more a consequence of the vertical slice. It's the vertical slice, its purpose is more narrative than mechanical. You know, like if this were a platformer, like, you know, like Mario, and this was a vertical slice of that, and that was our key experience, like we were trying to get at a key experience with the mechanics, then that's what we want to emphasize. But because the key experience is the narrative, that's what we chose to emphasize via the scenes included in the vertical slice, which means that you can't really get a clear mechanical picture, because a lot of our mechanical stuff is more across the entire game, and like one thing leading into another. The major difficulty, in a sense, was organization and remains organization, which is basically we have a script. You know, how are we going to bring it into the engine in a way that makes sense and in a way that makes it easy to navigate and reduces repeated information as much as possible? And I'd say we were marginally successful on that front. We used, I think, a fairly standard structure that, again, was basically just literal, like, here's a piece of text that's a line in the script. Here's who's saying it. Are they the player character? What is the portrait? You know, like a lot of data is locked into that data structure that should be moved up into an alternate system. So again, it works. I'm not, frankly, super happy with it, but the product is good. In terms of the successes, I think I'm really happy with the high-level organization, because the overall like scene-to-scene organization and the ability to sort of quickly and flexibly set up fairly complex scenarios, I think is quite good. And if you paired that with some refactoring in the actual dialogue system itself, I think it could lead to something pretty cool. And the UI animation is, in my opinion, is kind of like audio, where it's something that you don't necessarily notice in the front of your brain, but it's in the back of your brain. Like if it's not there, it's really, really clear. So in particular, I'm quite happy with the conversation system, animations and stuff. All of that is dynamically generated at runtime. and is entirely flexible. Like there's nothing pre-generated about the way that the conversation UI is set up, which is also really nice because it means if we continue on with the project, we don't have to worry about that. It's done. Yeah, and then there's some pooling stuff, but that's pretty boring. I just put it on there because I'm happy with it. Though it actually also needs to be refactored. The work is never done. That's the real lesson here. But yeah, that's all I got.
No, that again, it's kind of ridiculous when you think about how games get made, like all the moving parts and all of this community activity. It just really amazes me, and it's very refreshing to get Adam's description of how the code is working, and also like we could reorganize it this way, which shows you as we move on from prototype to the full production, like the level, what's involved with that. And you could tell from the writers, okay, we got to think through this, and this. From a coder's perspective, they're thinking, oh, the architecture needs to be this. From an artist's perspective, we got to reorient in terms of reintroducing color and thinking about a workflow that includes more 3D modeling. So it's very much a living thing, the game, you know, and you think of it as a piece of code or even a STEM endeavor, but it has a lot of organic, like evolving quality to it over time, which is part of like 25 people working on it. So, okay, having said that, what I'm gonna do now is Liam is gonna bring us home here talking about the audio. And so I think I'm on the right track here, and I'm gonna hit present, and Liam, you are up, and I will mute myself so we don't have a lot of feedback.
All right, cool. So yeah, I did the sound design on this, which on a production level side of things did involve a spreadsheet not quite as imposing as the one that Bree had to wrestle through and the other artists, but there was still a lot of asset tracking. And so basically my process starts always in a game with what is sound. It seems like a very fundamental thing to get out of the way, but I think it is, because basically what the questions you're answering in sound design are, what in this fictional scene is vibrating? What do those vibrations like manifest as? What do they sound like? And which of them are important for gameplay? Which of them are important for scene setting? And how can we get them all working in concert to where basically your brain doesn't feel that anything is out of the ordinary in what it's hearing? It feels integrated in terms of the interactions you're doing and the art you're seeing and all that. And so basically I see sound in games as reinforcing tone in terms of emotional tone and all that, and also thematic as well as overall aesthetic. So I'll get to historical realism here in a bit, but that was kind of one of my constraints as a sound designer here. And the other thing is feedback for the actual gameplay part of the game. So when you're clicking through this game and you hear that you read that you have taken a picture, you'll want to hear a camera clicking and whirring. And so I sought out sounds of a camera similar to the one that Margaret has, and recorded that and recorded its functions and put that together and stuck it in the game. And all that kind of builds towards this larger question that I think goes for any game discipline, especially ones that are historically minded. But my concern is about how the soundscape can lead towards this holistic goal of feeling immersed in a historical setting. And from that immersion comes this potential to empathize more greatly with the folks that actually lived through that stuff. Because when I feel that the more of your senses are engaged in even a simulacrum of what that was, the more likely you are to kind of feel like, I can kind of get where they're coming from here in terms of how it was to live through that. So next slide, Dave. Thank you. So aesthetic directions, yeah, historical realism. Basically, this is the second project in a row I've done sound design on that was in this kind of historical realist bent. And so basically what that means is at a practical level, a lot of listening to long ambient recordings that either you make or that other people have made around the world. So I was listening back on recordings I made in my house way out in the sticks. So not a lot of motor sound, but I'm still having to edit around jet planes flying overhead that, so there's no 757s in 1943. If someone drives by on their four-wheeler, I have to take account of that and cut around it. So there's the issue of anthropogenic sounds that would be ahistorical within there. And your brain might pick up on them. It might not, since you're already used to hearing them out and about. But for the sake of fidelity and empathy, in that having the absence of those kinds of modern sounds is important for the total sort of holistic immersive experience. I have here why are insects and wind so important. I wanted to have these be kind of common, almost acoustic themes in the game, because the way I sort of felt going into producing the soundscape was like, okay, it's Arkansas summer. What are the iconic sounds of that? Bugs, cicadas, birds. Like you can just, there are sounds that just sound hot. And for me, like cicadas singing in trees is one of those sounds that I could hear it in the dead of winter and I'll start sweating in my armpits because it's just, dang, that's the sound of summer right there. So I wanted that as kind of an acoustic element in these scenes to get at the common sort of shared, the fact that these stories all take place in the same geographical area, so it all sounds the same at a base level in terms of the ambient audio. And then with the wind, I saw that as a kind of thematic juxtaposition of the fact that these stories deal very largely with confinement and being trapped either within a system or like physically enclosed within a space. But wind is not subject to such things, especially not through a chain link fence. So having these kinds of sounds gets at the, at a practical level, it gets at the almost kind of madness-inducing winds that you sometimes get when it's just a windy day consistently all the time. But it also gets at this tension between freedom and entrapment that sort of runs through the whole game. That last bullet point there is just more of, I suppose, an anthropological interest of mine as a sound designer in terms of the fact that I'm recording all this and I'm recording around technologies that are implicated in a lot of the same geopolitical processes that were kickstarted in World War II, but it's more a matter of interest for Trivial Pursuit, less for practical sound design. But next slide, please, Dave. So yeah, this is kind of getting to those practical limitations of especially voice recording. So like that's a hard choice that you have to make in terms of the audio direction of a game and the audio implementation is, do you want it to be voice acted? If so, how much? Like as it stands, there's, I think, 22,000 words in the script right now. That's just with only 5 scenes. Voice recording for even just that would amount to at least 2.5 hours of audio. That would have to be edited down from like raw recording sessions of probably 5-6 hours of raw sound that you do have to listen through and make sure it all sounds good and mix and master it and all that. So voice recording is a big time and resource commitment that, given the quick turnaround of this project and some of the difficulties in terms of budget and contact imposed by the plague, we decided not at this time. The other things, my other limitation was more on the political side of things and epistemological, in that I'm still very much a practicing amateur in the field of historical soundscapes and acoustic history. So there's just a lot that I'm still learning about what would actually be audible at that time. Like if there are species that were more common back then, if there was this particular kind of engine that's difficult to find extant recordings of. So there's a lot of, you can get really into the nitty gritty details in constructing not only a plausible soundscape, but one that has a high level of fidelity to historical experience. So that's one difficulty. The other is one that I've encountered on a previous game we worked on called, that's under this sort of umbrella being Winter Scene in Brooklyn. And there we were recording voice actors in the studio. And it felt very strange for me as a white guy telling people how, directing them in terms of how to sound more like you are downtrodden. It's just like, this feels weird. I'm probably too young to be sorting this out on my own right now. I would appreciate more feedback from folks in terms of a good, compassionate, historically ethical and efficacious way to direct this. So in lieu of knowing that, it's better to go without as it stands, which isn't to say there's no voices in the game, because I had to record myself doing some muffled yelling because there's a couple times folks are yelling off screen. I've found some footage. I was trying to get the very fun story. The most fun I had trying to put something together was for, unfortunately, that got cut in this build for a playground scene at the camp where there was a basketball game going. And so it's very fun trying to find recordings of basketball that don't have either terrible reverb because they were recorded indoors in an arena setting, or that don't have a whole bunch of anthropogenic noise that would be ahistorical. And so I have to shout out some 12-year-old kid who took a 30-minute video of him and his friends playing basketball in a suburb just on a quiet evening, because I was able to draw some sounds from there. I made note of everything if I had to rip video from YouTube, the link, so that we could credit it in a fuller release, having an audio credit section for stuff like that. But yeah, we can move on to the next slide now, Dave. Oh, thank you, Laura. But yeah, this kind of brings us into the what I do differently. And what I do like about the soundscape as it stands in the game is that it really does go a long way towards selling the experience. I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but I do really like how the sound brings the pictures to life and really makes you feel more like you're in there. And it makes it more seamless, because even though you're looking at a black and white thing, your brain is still, I think even nowadays, folks have seen come up enough on animation that their brains kind of make that integration fairly seamlessly. So it's very cool to see it. It's always cool to see it in practice. No matter how many games I work on, it's always very neat to actually get some sounds in there. And I do feel that as it stands, it's pretty historically plausible. There's no cell phones going off. Nobody's speaking Esperanto or anything. You can't hear any jetliners that I know of. So I'm happy with the plausibility as it stands. But what I would want to change is that I did not get the chance to go down in the visit in 2019. That was before I was formally on the project. I was brought on last summer. And so one thing I would want to do is I'd want to go down to the site at Monticello and the site at Rower and actually get ambient audio from there at during the summer when the game is set. Because even though it's still Arkansas, it is the Delta, so it's going to be a different sort of space in terms of how sound propagates through it. There will be slightly different species there. As it stands, the soundscape is not necessarily ecologically accurate, and so I could get a Neil deGrasse Tyson type coming after me if they so chose. But in any case, I would want to go down and record there. in terms of the taking some of the limits off the historical plausibility, I did miss the inclusion of the mythic and fable sections in this game, because there's a lot more room for sonic experimentation and like doing more out there stuff with that kind of thing that would be less grounded and like, no, this has to be a pretty mundane situation. So being able to move away from the strictly mundane to more of the mythological would be fun, just to see what kind of experiences and things I could find digging around in there. And I'd also want to just do more focused Foley work and really get the sound like mixed and mastered well. Because I think, especially for for scene 13 and the more linear movie scenes, having something that is basically almost a radio play going alongside would be really cool. And I also want to, I was informed of, made aware of a lot of the musical tradition there through just a Denosho Encyclopedia entry that someone shared with me. And it's cool because there's a rich musical tradition and musical experience at the camp. Oh, yeah, thank you, Brittany. Yeah, because there was a lot of like folks playing traditional Japanese music in terms of educating one another, folks playing American popular tunes at the time. Dance and theater were huge in the social activity calendar at the camp. And so being able to explore more of that, potentially getting some recordings of musical accompaniment to theater performances from contemporary performers and integrating that into the game to like really bring out more of the cultural experience would be really cool. And so, yeah, I think just more sounds is what I'd want to change. And that is what I have.
Okay. So let me, get out of that.
I did want to mention before we move on, I would say, just because I thought of this while Leon was talking, I actually think the biggest success of this project from like a studio standpoint is our project management and our management of timelines. I thought was extremely successful. And a lot of that credit, I think, goes to Bree. I just wanted to make that externalized, because we were talking a little bit before the thing about how we didn't really have to crunch, which normally we have at least a couple of days of like, especially bug fixing right at the end. And this time it was pretty smooth and pretty easy. And yeah, I can't really overstate how much effective timeline management is important to a project like this, and scale management as well. You know, choosing to cut things, you know, early, which I think is very wise and I mean difficult to do.
Yeah. So we're a bit over time, but not terrible. We do have another Zoom coming up at 7. We're reached a point where if people would like to ask questions about this, I haven't had a chance to look at the chat, so I don't know what we've got in there. But yeah, that's our set of presentations about how we put this game together. And I think it really emerged how organic that process is, very much a human process. And also, even though we're releasing this thing, our collective sense of this is great, it's not done. This is great, it's not done. Like those are the two sides of your brain. We definitely, for me now, it's the process of how do we fund the full thing? And where do the proposals go? There's familiar sources like the NEH. I think we want to expand that sort of ambit of who we're looking for funding. But on the whole, I think as a release product and a prototype, it's really strong. You can see our sense of like being tantalized by what we know is like the next step here. But having said all that, let's go ahead and see if we have questions on the chat. Let me take a look down there. And Bree, if you've had a chance to sort of look through that for me.
I don't think we have any questions there. A lot of good back and forth, but no questions.
Okay. Well, now if you have questions, now would be a good time to ask them then. You can just go ahead and put up your hand if you have a question or a comment or whatever. because if not, I'm going to give out, again, a huge shout out and expression of thanks to the development team for this and everybody who presented tonight. And again, I think it was very, very appropriate for Adam to point out the role that Bree played in organizing this kind of crazy thing that's a game and getting us to this. Yeah, that's a clap. That's a golf clap for sure. And getting us to where we are at with the game. And that everyone is pretty much all smiles at this point. That's always good. And I agree. Crunch, and Greg could agree a lot more. Crunch can be this horrible thing that happens at the end of a game process. But this one, you know, we had a little bit, but it was pretty manageable. So, okay, then we are going to wrap this one up, and we're looking forward to 7 o'clock when we will have sort of a lightning round of things using game design, game engines at the University of Arkansas. Then our closing presentation by Derek Ham, which I'm super excited about. Okay, well, thank you all for joining. Ciao.